Picture this, a dusty town, where the wind howls through empty streets and tumbleweeds roll by. The air is thick with the scent of adventure and danger. A saloon door swinging open, creaking on its hinges as if it hasn't been touched in years. And a figure emerging, silhouetted against the setting sun, casting long shadows on the ground. This, my friends, is the classic image of a desperado. A lone figure standing tall and unyielding, embodying the spirit of the Wild West. But what makes a desperado a desperado? Is it the way they walk, the way they talk, or something deeper? The word itself comes from the Spanish desesperado, meaning desperate. Fitting, right? But it's more than just desperation. Desperados are the folks who've thrown out the rulebook. They live by their own code, one that's often at odds with society's norms. They live outside the law, often by choice, embracing a life of freedom and danger. And they're not afraid to use force to get what they want. Think Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and other notorious figures, or any number of Wild West legends who became symbols of rebellion and defiance. These weren't just bank robbers, they were symbols of a time when law and order were as shaky as a saloon table after a 3-day bender. They thrived in chaos, making their mark on history. But here's the thing about desperados, they're not just dusty relics of the past, their spirit lives on in modern times. The urge to buck the system, to say screw it to authority, is as timeless as a cowboy hat. Whether in the Old West or today's world, the desperado's spirit endures, challenging the status quo and inspiring those who dare to live on their own terms. The American West in the late 19th century was basically a giant social experiment. It was a place where the old rules didn't necessarily apply, and new ones were being written on the fly. The vast, untamed land was a blank canvas, and the people who ventured into it were the artists, each with their own vision of what life could be. This was a time of great opportunity, but also great risk. The promise of land, wealth, and a fresh start drew people from all corners of the world, each bringing their own hopes and dreams. You had folks from all walks of life thrown together in a vast, untamed land. There were immigrants seeking a new life, freed slaves looking for a place to call their own, and adventurers chasing the thrill of the unknown. This melting pot of cultures and backgrounds created a unique social fabric, one that was as diverse as it was unpredictable. The American West was a place where anyone could reinvent themselves for better or for worse. There were settlers, miners, ranchers, and of course, a healthy dose of outlaws. Each group had its own role to play in the unfolding drama of the West. Settlers built towns and farms, miners dug for precious metals, and ranchers herded cattle across vast plains. But it was the outlaws who often captured the public's imagination. These were the men and women who lived on the fringes of society, defying the law and living by their own rules. This was a time and place where the rule of law was often more of a suggestion. With courts miles away and lawmen stretched thin, justice was often a matter of personal interpretation. Vigilante justice was not uncommon, and disputes were frequently settled with a quick draw rather than a courtroom debate. The lack of a strong legal system meant that people had to rely on their own wits and resources to survive. Courts were miles away, sheriffs were outnumbered, and if you had a fast horse and an itchy trigger finger, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. The isolation and vast distances between settlements made it difficult for any centralized authority to maintain control. This environment was a double-edged sword. It offered freedom and opportunity, but also danger and lawlessness. For many, the thrill of living on the edge was worth the risk. This environment created the perfect breeding ground for desperados. These were individuals who thrived in the chaos, using it to their advantage. They were often seen as both villains and heroes, depending on who you asked. Some were driven by greed, others by a desire for revenge, and still others by a simple need to survive. Whatever their motivations, they became legends in their own right. These were people who, for whatever reason, decided that the rules didn't apply to them. They lived by their own code, one that often put them at odds with the rest of society. Some were outcasts, others were rebels, but all of them were products of their environment. The harsh conditions of the West demanded a certain toughness, a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. Maybe they were escaping their past, maybe they were just greedy, or maybe they were just bored. The reasons for turning to a life of crime were as varied as the individuals themselves. Some saw it as a way to escape a troubled past, others as a means to an end. For some, the thrill of the chase was its own reward. Whatever their reasons, they left an indelible mark on the history of the American West. Whatever their reasons, desperados became both feared and romanticized figures. They were the stuff of legend, their exploits retold in dime novels and campfire stories. They embodied the spirit of rebellion and individualism that defined the American West. But they also served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of a society without rules. They were symbols of rebellion, of individualism, and of the dangers of a society without rules. Their stories continue to captivate us, reminding us of a time when the line between right and wrong was often blurred, and the only law was the law of survival. Okay, now let's talk anarchy. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, often by people who just finished reading a philosophy textbook. But at its core, anarchy is pretty simple. It's the absence of government or any kind of imposed authority. Think of it like this. Imagine a world without police, without laws, without anyone telling you what to do. Sounds pretty great, right? Well, maybe. See, anarchy is based on the idea that humans are inherently good and capable of governing themselves without the need for rules. It's a lovely thought, but history has shown us that it's not always that simple. The idea of anarchy has been around for centuries. The ancient Greeks had a word for it, anarchia. Even back then, some folks thought, hey, maybe all this government stuff is a bit much. Fast forward a few centuries, and you've got anarchist thinkers popping up during the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. These were people who believed in individual liberty and saw government as a tool of oppression. And let's not forget about punk rock. In the 1970s, anarchy became a symbol of rebellion against authority, conformity, and pretty much everything else. Section 5, Desperados versus Anarchy, two sides of the same coin. So, how do desperados and anarchy relate to each other? At first glance, they might seem like completely different phenomena. One is often romanticized in tales of the Wild West, while the other is frequently depicted as chaotic and destructive. But if we dig a little deeper, we can find some intriguing connections. Well, they're kind of like distant cousins who show up to the same family reunion and make everyone uncomfortable. Both challenge the status quo, but in very different ways. Their presence disrupts the norm, causing unease among those who prefer stability and order. Desperados operate outside the law, but they don't necessarily want to dismantle the entire system. They exploit the system's weaknesses for their own gain. Whether it's robbing a bank or hijacking a shipment, they are opportunists looking for the next big score. They're in it for themselves, whether it's money, power, or just the thrill of the ride. Their actions are driven by personal motives, often at the expense of others. They thrive on the adrenaline rush and the allure of living on the edge. Anarchy, on the other hand, is about rejecting the very concept of imposed authority. It's a philosophy that seeks to eliminate hierarchies and create a society based on voluntary cooperation. Anarchists believe that true freedom can only be achieved when individuals govern themselves. It's about creating a society where everyone is free and equal, with no need for rulers or laws. In an ideal anarchist world, communities would function through mutual aid and consensus rather than coercion and control. In a way, you could say that desperados are a symptom of a system that's already failing. They emerge in times of instability, taking advantage of the cracks in the foundation. Their actions highlight the vulnerabilities and inefficiencies within the existing order. They thrive in environments where law and order are weak or non-existent. In such settings, the rules are fluid, and the strongest or most cunning individuals rise to the top. Desperados find their niche in these chaotic landscapes, where survival often depends on one's wits and ruthlessness. Anarchy, on the other hand, is about intentionally creating a world without those structures in the first place. It's a proactive approach to dismantling the old and building something new. Anarchists envision a society where cooperation replaces competition, and where communities are built on shared values and mutual respect. Section 6, Modern-Day Desperados, from Wall Street to your Wi-Fi. Now, you might be thinking, okay John, but what about today? Are there still desperados running around? Oh, you bet there are. They just look a little different these days. Forget the cowboy hats and six-shooters. Today's desperados wear designer suits and carry briefcases. They're the CEOs who prioritize profits over people, the politicians who exploit their power for personal gain, and the internet scammers who prey on the vulnerable. They might not be robbing stagecoaches, but they're still operating outside the bounds of ethical and legal behavior. They're the ones who bend the rules, exploit loopholes, and say, "Catch me if you can," to the rest of us. Section 7. Anarchy now, from protest movements to online forums. Anarchy too has evolved beyond Molotov cocktails and punk rock anthems, though those still exist too, for better or worse. Today you can find anarchist ideas popping up in everything from environmental activism to anti-globalization movements. It's about challenging systems of power and control, whether it's the government, corporations, or even social norms. The internet in particular has become a breeding ground for anarchist thought and organizing. Online forums and social media platforms allow for the free exchange of ideas, often without the constraints of traditional media or government censorship. Of course, this can be a double-edged sword. While it allows for greater freedom of expression, it can also lead to the spread of misinformation and harmful ideologies. Section 8. Why should we care about words like these anyway? So, why should we even care about dusty old words like desparado and anarchy? Well, because understanding these concepts helps us make sense of the world around us. When we see CEOs getting away with shady business practices or politicians bending the rules to benefit themselves, we can recognize them for what they are: modern-day desperados. And when we hear about protests against inequality or calls for more democratic systems, we can see the influence of anarchist thought, even if those involved don't identify as anarchists themselves. These concepts, though rooted in history, are still relevant today. They help us understand the ongoing struggle between individual freedom and collective responsibility, between order and chaos. Section 9. So, are we all just desperados waiting for anarchy? Not necessarily. But it's important to recognize that these impulses, the desire for freedom, the rejection of authority, the temptation to break the rules, exist within all of us to some degree. The challenge is to find a balance. We need rules and systems to prevent chaos and protect the vulnerable. But we also need to be wary of those who abuse their power and to speak out against injustice. So, the next time you hear the word desperado or anarchy, don't just think of cowboys and punks. Think about what those words represent: the timeless human struggle for freedom, fairness, and a better world.